The command cracked through the salt air like a whip. Undress, now. The beach at Chimu Bay fell silent. Wind moved through the pandanus trees. Canvas tents snapped. 300 Japanese civilian women, nurses, clerks, radio operators in patched khaki, stared at the line of American MPs and the sign behind them. Quarantine, no entry. Someone dropped a canteen. It hit coral with a hollow ring that made several women flinch as if struck. Keiko Sato didn't realize she'd spoken aloud until the woman beside her squeezed her wrist. "This is where they break us," Keiko whispered. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. The Marines didn't shout. They didn't smirk. They waited. A gull screamed over the breakers. Fuel drums thudded as a forklift coughed and lurched. The smell, iodine, diesel, wet rope, wrapped around everything. Keiko's boots had rubbed her heels raw during 3 days of marching south. Blood had dried in stiff crescents inside her socks. She tried to focus on pain. Pain was simple. Shame was not. "Move it along," an MP called. But the tone was clipped, procedural, like a station master shepherding passengers. Not enemies. At the front of the line, a Nisei interpreter in a dusty army shirt raised both hands, palms out. "Aisei kensa desu. Baioki o fusegu tame. Keiga wa arimasen. Hygiene inspection. To prevent disease. No harm." The words bounced off disbelief. A woman stepped forward, hair hacked short with a pocket knife, uniform hanging off her like a borrowed name. She untied her belt with stiff fingers. A second followed. The line shivered and moved. Inside the long, low tent, the world changed temperature. Lanterns swung and painted gullies of light along khaki walls. Pipes ticked. A canvas sheet divided the space. Beyond it, women stood with towels clamped under their arms, eyes fixed on the dirt. Not rope, not cuffs. Towels. Keiko tried to hide the tremor in her hands as she worked the buttons of her tunic. She kept her gaze at the level of boots, the MP's polished leather, the medic's muddy canvas. When she lifted her eyes, a white rectangle blinked in and out with each lantern sway. The Red Cross stenciled on a crate. Name? The voice was male but gentle, worn smooth by use. She looked up into a sun-browned face under a faded cap. The medic's rank chevron had frayed threads like sea whiskers. He didn't look at her body. He looked at the clipboard. "Name?" he repeated slower. "Sato Keiko," she said, Japanese first, English after. Her mouth had to relearn the shape of words that weren't commands. "Keiko," he tried, not unkindly, and wrote it down. "I'm Sergeant Miller. This will be quick." He nodded toward the divider. "Dr. Lewis is that side. You'll be given soap. Towels are yours to keep, yours to keep." The sentence sounded like a trick. War had trained her to hear hooks inside gifts. Through the divider, a woman sobbed once, short, strangled, then fell silent. The hiss of valves answered, a soft rain of mist. The smell of delousing powder rose like chalk dust after eraser strikes on a schoolboard. Keiko clenched her jaw. She felt the cold shadow of a rumor she'd carried for years. Camps where showers meant smoke and silence forever. But the interpreter's voice cut through. "Kosui janai, kusuri." Not gas. Medicine, a nurse in a white smock, an American woman, hair pinned tight, freckles bright as sparks, held out a square of coarse soap and looked over Keiko's left shoulder while doing it, as if the air behind her deserved more attention than the curves of her shame. That studied not-looking hit harder than any kindness Keiko had imagined. It was a kind of respect that didn't know its own name. "Arigato," Keiko murmured. The word felt traitorous and necessary. The water was barely warm. It ran in timed bursts, 2 minutes by a wall clock with a hairline crack through the 12. The nurses called out seconds like referees. The room filled with motion, ribs rising and falling, shoulders hunching, hands scrubbing beneath collarbones where lice hid, silence punctured by squeezed-out breaths. When the valves clanged shut, 100 towels opened like sails. Miller kept his distance and checked for fever with the back of his wrist, the way Keiko's father had checked hers when she was 8, and an August typhoon had bowed the bamboo in their yard. "You've lost weight," he said softly, more to the clipboard than to her. "We'll fix that." Fix. As if bodies were radios. Outside, the sun had shifted. The sea had laid itself down and glittered like hammered steel. The women stood in a loose cluster, towels close, eyes wider than the horizon, waiting for the humiliation that surely came after false mercy. Instead, a cook wheeled out a galvanized tub that steamed like a hot spring. The smell made the back of Keiko's tongue ache. Onions, barley, meat. Real meat, the cook. Forearms flour white, wedding ring dull with salt, ladled stew into dented tin bowls. He didn't try a smile. He pointed to his own mouth and then to the spoon. Eat. No one wanted to be first. Then Akemi, the oldest among them, lifted a spoon with a tiny tremor and took one clumsy mouthful. Her eyes closed. When they opened, something in her had sat down and taken off its pack. Keiko ate. Heat washed through her chest and turned her bones from glass to wood. The second bowl came without asking. The cook set a square of soft bread on top like a roof. Why? Keiko asked the interpreter when he drifted near, pencil behind his ear. It escaped her like a leak in a hull. He tapped the red cross on the crate. Rules, rules, not mercy. Somehow that struck harder than mercy could. Mercy could turn. Rules held. By evening the women had clean shifts. Their old uniforms disappeared. Burned, they were told, to kill whatever lived in their seams. They watched smoke rise in a dark ribbon over the palms and felt something like grief for the cloth that had once made them feel armored against invisibility. A typhoon flag snapped up the pole at dusk. Red square. Black square. Storm coming, someone said. An MP jogged the fence line, latches clacking as he checked and rechecked them. The air went metallic the way air does before weather decides to change its mind about what sky should be. That night, sleep came in shreds. Keiko lay awake and made a list. Things that felt impossible that morning which were now true. She stopped at 8 because she was tired of realizing she didn't understand the shape of the world anymore. Before dawn, a whistle tore the tent open. All detainees to quarantine block C, a voice barked. Boots thudded. Lanterns flared. Somewhere on the other side of the wire a generator coughed itself to death. A second voice, sharp, younger, cut across the first. Double time, move, move. Keiko's heart twisted. The old nightmare rose, inspection as prelude, kindness as trap. As the line formed, she saw Sergeant Miller up ahead, cap in his hand, jaw tight. He looked like a man ordering himself to be two people at once. They moved, past the stew drums, past the burn pit, toward the concrete block stamped with a stenciled number and the word showers in letters so neat they might have been drawn with a ruler. Undress, a medic called as they filed inside. Steam ghosted around the lamp cages. Pipes rattled with a throat-clearing sound. Keiko's hands went cold. The room remembered her fear even if she didn't want to. The mirrors, tin-framed and cloudy, threw back faces that looked like hers and didn't. Eyes closed, the nurse said. 2 minutes. Breathe. The hiss began. A woman screamed, and then, nothing terrible happened. The mist scratched their throats with the peppery bite of disinfectant. Soap rasped. Towels found shoulders. The hissing stopped. Silence fell except for drips counting seconds on the floor. Keiko opened her eyes. In the glass was a person she hadn't met. Jaw sharper. Collarbone underlined. Eyes that had seen themselves and not looked away. Outside, wind pressed the palms sideways like painted grass. Miller stood under the eave, rain stippling his shoulders. An MP jogged over and spoke close to his ear. Miller's face changed in the way faces do when they hear something that moves a piece of furniture inside them. The MP looked past Miller, past the interpreter, past everyone, to the women under the awning. He pointed toward the seawall where waves had begun to strike flat and mean. Evacuation, the interpreter said, the word shaped like a cough. Now, to where? Akemi asked. The interpreter didn't answer. He pointed at the trucks. Keiko's towel slipped at her collarbone. She tightened it and felt the pulse under the notch. The storm's first hard drops hit the packed coral yard like thrown rice. Somewhere a sheet of tin clanged. Somewhere a rope split like a whip. She climbed into the truck bed and grabbed the slat with both hands. A Marine slammed the tailgate. Heads down! The first punch of wind hit like a hand. The truck lurched forward toward a place with a concrete roof and a door that locked from the outside. The wind found seams you didn't know a building had. It shouted through them. It pressed a flat palm over the camp and held. Rain came at an angle that made it feel like a trick. How could water move like nails? Inside the storm shelter, an ammunition bunker retasked as mercy. Breath turned the air human warm. Lanterns swung and made light pool and run. The door boomed and boomed as gusts shouldered it. A child started to cry. A sound Keiko didn't realize she'd been braced to hear until it happened. Someone began to hum a thread of a lullaby no one remembered all the words to. Then, over the racket, a new sound cut in. A splash like a table being overturned. Shouts. Man overboard! Another voice, hoarse. 2 of them. The interpreter went pale. He looked at the far end of the bunker where the drainage culvert emptied into the storm ditch. The ditch, in this weather, was a river. Miller didn't hesitate. He shoved the lantern into the interpreter's hands with a quick, Hold that high, and ran. The door fought him. He swore at it politely, like a man coaxing a mule, and slid through a slice of black roar. For one heartbeat the opening framed him. A man in a rain-smashed world before the door banged shut and the storm tried to erase him. Keiko stared at the seam where he'd been, like it might give back an answer. Minutes can be long enough to become stories later. These were that kind. When the door tore open again, 2 Marines stagged in wet as fish and carrying more water than seemed possible on clothing. Between them, lolling like she'd been poured into their arms, was a woman. Hair plastered, eyes rolling, mouth open in a soundless "oh." Behind them, Miller half-hauled, half-carried a second, smaller figure. A girl maybe 16, lips blue, hands clawing at air. They slammed the door. The storm threw itself against wood and lost. "Blankets!" Miller barked, and the command had the thunder's authority without its cruelty. The nurses moved with martial grace. Blankets became cocoons. A stove black with use flared and made air that wasn't war, wasn't fear, was simply warm. Miller knelt by the younger girl and pinched her earlobe between thumb and forefinger. He put his mouth near her ear. "Stay with me," he said. Not a plea, a job description. "Why did you go out?" The question escaped Keiko before someone could tell it not to. Miller shrugged like the storm hadn't just tried to file him down to a smaller shape. "Because the ditch doesn't care what uniform you wear." The line landed with a weight that rearranged the room. The typhoon bullied the island until almost noon. In those hours, Americans and Japanese shared a bench and a blanket and the fact of mortality. Someone produced a harmonica with a dent like a missing tooth. A Marine with rope burns across both palms blew a tune so stubbornly cheerful, it felt like a threat thrown back at the weather. Keiko didn't recognize the song. It claimed space inside her anyway. When the door finally opened to a sky the color of dishwater, and a wind that had gotten tired of being a god, the camp looked smaller, edges ripsawed. Fence line draped with palm fronds like a parade gone wrong. The bunker empties became a procession. Last out were the rescued women, pale but walking. The younger clutched a blanket like a flag. She looked at Miller as if memorizing him to tell a story later. The storm had broken something brittle and left it in pieces that fit better. From that day, the Americans' kindness stopped feeling like contraband. It felt like policy, which in a way it was. The Geneva Conventions lived in the camp like electricity. Invisible until you touched a wire and realized it had been running the lights the whole time. The guards kept distance. The nurses kept dignity. The interpreter kept nuance. Miller kept showing up where people looked like they might fall down. The biggest shift arrived in a wooden crate. It landed in the medical tent with a clatter that made everyone turn. Stamped on the side, U.S. Army, Field Hospital, Education, Recreation. Inside were books, some with water stains, some with library cards still in their pockets, magazines with actresses on the covers, dog-eared readers. A grammar with pencil ghosts in the margins. There were also 2 record sleeves wrapped in wax paper and a rectangle of paper that said, "Donated by Lincoln High School, Nebraska, for people who need pages." The interpreter read it out in Japanese. Someone laughed, surprised at how the word Nebraska sat in that sentence like an orange in snow. Lieutenant Hanover, rigid posture, spectacles that magnified the exactness of what he said, cleared his throat. "Library hours will be posted. Borrowing is a privilege, not a right." He paused. Privileges can become habits. The first time Keiko took a book from that crate, she did it the way you touch a sleeping dog. Slowly, lightly, and with the knowledge it might wake into teeth. She chose a book of short stories by an American woman who used sentences like ropes thrown between 2 docks and made the step between them feel less risky. At the same time the books arrived, so did the lessons. 3 afternoons a week, under an awning that the typhoon had tried and failed to steal, a chalkboard appeared. On it, chalk letters bloomed. Food, water, family, respect. A nurse wrote the English words. The interpreter placed their Japanese beside them like a matching set of bowls. The women spoke, stumbled, laughed, tried again. The nurses learned sumimasen and itadakimasu. The prisoners learned towel doctor, horizon. The twist everyone would later talk about, the one that made the Americans glow inside the story instead of just standing kindly at its edges, didn't arrive as a speech or a parade. It happened one evening when the generator coughed itself to sleep, and the camp slid into a darkness that made even the palms lean closer to hear. An MP approached the women's barracks holding a box. Not a food box. A shoe box, old and soft at the corners, lid held on with a drawstring. Volunteer letters. he said to the interpreter. Homefront project for you, the interpreter blinked. Letters? To them? From them, the MP corrected, nodding to the prisoners. From Americans, civilians, kids, church groups, sewing circles. People who wanted to write to someone on the enemy list and remind themselves they were human. He lifted the lid. Paper rustled. The top envelope was written in pencil, crooked as a fence on a hill. Dear lady, I don't know. The women didn't reach for the letters at first. They were used to paper as a trap. Then the nurse with freckles took one and held it like a cup of hot tea. She looked at Keiko. Would you like me to read? Keiko nodded. The nurse unfolded the letter and the room leaned toward her voice. Dear lady, I don't know. I am 11. My name is Ruthie. I don't know what to say, except I hope you are okay. My mama says the war is like a bad storm, and after storms we pick up sticks together. I made you a paper crane. If you can't keep it, will you think about it? Love, Ruthie in Kansas. Ruthie had drawn the crane. Its triangle wings were lopsided and perfectly right. The second letter was from a plumbers' union in Ohio. When the pipes break, everybody's water's on the floor. A third was from a woman in California who wrote, My husband's in the Pacific. I hope someone is being kind to him. I'm trying to be kind to you. A fourth from a black church choir in Louisiana. We know about being told to stand at the back. We sing anyway. Inside was a hymn copied by hand. The letters made a new noise in the barracks, sniffling that people pretended were coughs and didn't bother to correct. That night, under the mosquito net that always caught the one mosquito that got through, Keiko didn't try to sleep. She pressed her palm to her sternum and felt the little engine of her heart. She thought about a girl with a paper crane in a place called Kansas, a word that sounded like a canoe bumping a dock. She thought about a man who had walked into weather because the ditch doesn't care. She thought about rules that had decided to be a kind of love because love was too risky to name at first. In the morning, something else happened that didn't belong to war as she'd been taught it. Lieutenant Hanover stood on a crate with the easy balance of a farm kid standing on a fence and cleared his throat. We have news, he said. He looked at the interpreter. He looked at the sky. He took off his cap as if the air had just become a room. The Emperor has accepted the terms. Hostilities have ceased, the interpreter translated. The words went out like a wave and came back as stillness. No one cheered. An MP crossed himself in a small, practiced motion. The nurse folded the letter from Ruthie and slid it into her breast pocket as if it were a fragile machine that might continue to work if kept close to warmth. Hanover put his cap back on and made his voice the size of a plan. Repatriation will begin. We will feed you until you are strong enough to travel. We will issue clothing. We will arrange transport to Yokohama. He paused again. If you wish, we will provide paper and envelopes. If you write to someone you love, we will try to find them. We cannot promise answers. We can promise the attempt. It was the promise that made Keiko's throat close. War had been so full of certainty. Peace, it turned out, was made of attempts. She took the paper. She took the envelope. She wrote, Dear Otosan, if this finds you, know that I am alive because an enemy refused to be one. She folded the letter and gave it to Lieutenant Hanover, who put it in a canvas sack with a gentleness that said he had not always handled mail that mattered this much. On the pier a week later, when the repatriation ship's horn moaned like a cow across a winter pasture, Sergeant Miller stood with his hands hooked in his belt and an expression that pretended not to be relief. Keiko walked up the gangway with a blanket over her shoulders and a suitcase that was 90% air. When she reached the top, she looked back. Miller raised his hand. It wasn't a salute. It wasn't a wave. It was that American thing, an unpolished acknowledgement that made the space between two people feel less taxed. Thank you, Keiko said in Japanese. She tried English and missed the target in a way that still carried meaning. Thank for life. Miller nodded once, as if to say you would have done it too, and turned so she wouldn't have to watch the moment end. Yokohama smelled like ash and rust. The first step Keiko took onto the dock felt like stepping onto a map of a country that had yet to be drawn. She carried half her weight in a package she hadn't wanted. Hunger knotted with guilt. Relief braided with a grief that didn't know its list of names yet. The American-run reception center was a machine that had learned to say please. A clerk from Iowa, hair parted so straight it looked like a surveyor had done it. Stamped cards, issued rations, taught his mouth sato so it wouldn't step on the syllables. A Japanese social worker guided people toward trains that had once carried soldiers and now carried ghosts home to their kitchens. Keiko's house in Kawasaki was a fox story. Everyone had heard it existed. No one had seen it lately. The lot still had its stones. The stones still had their moss. The house did not have a roof. Her father's neighbor, Mrs. Yoshikawa, materialized from the skeleton of a doorway like smoke deciding to be a person and pressed a hand to her mouth. "Eya," the older woman breathed, and then she did something no one else had managed to do without breaking. She smiled with every wrinkle on her face. "You made it." A tatami was unrolled on a floor where the stars came through at night and watched. The first rain sounded like a drum trying out a new rhythm on the beams that remained. When Keiko dreamed, she dreamed of the storm bunker, and woke surprised she wasn't warm. She gave herself a job, small repairs. If she couldn't push history, she could hammer nails. She straightened bent nails with a rock. She lashed broken beams with rope. She took a tin cup to the communal soup line and learned the new geometry of kindness, how it bent across languages and found shortest paths. Her letter to her father did not return. A month passed. Then 2. Winter took the fields in its fist and squeezed. People learned how to step on ground that had been powdered glass and not cut their feet too often. Children learned how to play in ruins, which is to say they learned to play anywhere. In January, a knock came at a door that wasn't a door. A man in a coat that didn't quite fit, carrying a bag that did. He had the posture of someone used to where walls should be. He bowed in the old way, and then offered a Western handshake, as if testing which kind of bridge would hold. "I am Tanaka," he said. "War Records Office, we have something for you." Keiko's stomach did the animal thing, jumped and braced at the same time. Tanaka set the bag on the makeshift table. He drew out an envelope with edges that had memorized other hands. U.S. Army Postal Service lived in the corner in purple ink. "From Okinawa," he said. Keiko didn't sit. She held the envelope in both hands and thought of the storm door, the book crate, the paper crane. She slid a finger under the flap. A shorter envelope fell out of the long one. Inside that, a sheet of paper blue-lined like a schoolchild's page, "Miss Sato. I hope this finds you in a good winter. It is Sergeant Miller writing, because your lieutenant asked for someone with neat letters. I remember you, not because of anything you did wrong or right, just because the day the storm came, you looked at me like I was something you could not yet believe. I hope you can believe it now. We got a letter for you passed back through channels. I include it with this. I do not know if the man is yours. I hope he is." Miller Keiko's fingers misread the second paper and fumbled it. She caught it against her chest. The paper was older, thinner, more likely to break if looked at wrong. "My daughter, Keiko. They tell me a letter can find you if I write in care of many strangers. I am not good at letters. I am good at mending shoes. Today I mended the strap of a boy's sandal. I thought of your school shoes, and how you scuffed them on purpose when you were angry. If you are alive, know that I am old and stubborn, and I eat what is given. If you are not, I will still be old and stubborn. I will set a place for you at New Year. If an American is reading this to you, tell him I am grateful he is not a monster. Your Oto-san, Sato Ichiro." Now of nothing in particular Keiko didn't realize she'd sat until her knees found the tatami. She read them both again. She read them aloud to the air. She folded them and unfolded them and learned the creases they wanted. Then she wrote, "Sergeant Miller. There is snow on the tiles that are left. It makes everything look like a repair that might hold. Please tell Ruthie in Kansas that her crane has flown this far. I am putting it in my pocket when I go to look for my father's gaze in every man at the soup line." She didn't have an address. She sent it anyway to Lincoln High School via the U.S. Army because attempts were the new currency. Spring made good on a promise everyone suspected it had forgotten. Buds appeared on branches that had no right to be alive. The women at the soup line began trading recipes in the past tense as if that could substitute for ingredients. Keiko found a job at the market mending umbrella ribs with wire from a downed radio tower. She liked the small sound the pliers made when they got a thing exactly right. One afternoon, a rectangle of paper appeared at her stall, shadowed by a boy with socks that didn't match. He stood, awkward as a foal, and held the paper like a treasure map. "From the post," he said, proud to have been chosen by the day to carry meaning. The envelope had traveled more than most ships. Inside were 2 things, a letter and a photograph. The letter: "Keiko. I read your note to Ruthie and to my mother, who is good at making casseroles last longer than anyone expects. Ruthie says to tell you Kansas has a sky so big it makes you feel brave or small depending on the day. She wants to know if you have ever seen a tornado and how it compares to our storms. I am back in Nebraska. I fix tractors and the way I sleep. Some nights I almost manage both. I enclosed a photograph a buddy took the morning you sailed. He said, 'What for?' And I said, 'Because someone will need proof later that a thing happened other than the bad thing. Be well. Eat bread. Try not to let the world tell you what it is too often. Miller. The photograph was the color of tobacco and sun, edges scalloped like pie crust. It showed the pier, the ship, the ladder, a woman in a blanket turning her head. Her mouth was half open as if catching a last word. In the background, a man stood with his hands hooked in his belt, trying to look like a person who wasn't going to remember this exact minute for the rest of his life. Keiko put the photograph under the one unbroken piece of glass in the house and weighted it with a rock until the curl gave up. She lit a stick of incense and balanced it in a bottleneck. Smoke rose and made shapes that were either prayers or weather. Years did what years do. They added and subtracted. They gave Keiko a son and took Mrs. Yoshikawa on an evening when the light was too beautiful to waste, and she decided not to. They built a roof over the tatami and put cracks in the plaster where future grandchildren would trace runs like rivers on a map. They turned the letter paper brittle and the ink honest about its age. In 1964, during the Olympics in Tokyo, Keiko watched a runner from America pass a baton to a runner from Japan and thought the ditch doesn't care what uniform you wear and smiled like a person who had been present when a line changed its mind about where to be drawn. In 1985, a letter came with a postmark that made her chest tighten. Lincoln. Nay, the handwriting had learned to be older. Keiko. Ruthie is a teacher now. She says to tell you she still makes cranes. I married a woman who can fix anything that plugs in and some things that don't. I don't fix tractors much. I read more. Our high school is having a display. Letters across a war. They asked if I had anything. I took them your father's words. Photocopy only. Yours should stay yours. And my note and the picture of you at the gangway. They put them next to a helmet and a map and a girl from Kansas's paper bird. If you ever come this way, there's a sky I'd like you to meet. Miller. Keiko showed the letter to her son, who had learned English the way he'd learned to ride a bicycle, by crashing until it didn't hurt as much. And he said, "You should go." She did not go. Life has its own customs paperwork and visas. Instead, in 1990, she took the photograph to a small museum in Yokohama that smelled like varnish and funding applications. She told the curator, a woman with hair the color of thoughtful iron, "This is proof that something other than the bad thing happened." The curator glanced at the edges, at the pier, at the blanket. She held the picture with two hands the way you hold a bowl you respect. "We will make it a wall," she said, "so it can hold some weight." They built an exhibit no one expected to be popular, and which consistently had a line, "Mercy in Transit." It wasn't medals or maps. It was towels, letters, a crate label, a page from a grammar book with horizon underlined twice, a harmonica with a dent, a photograph of a pier. Visitors stood and read and didn't need to be told to be quiet. The sound of reading is the sound of reverence anyway. One afternoon, a family stood in front of the photograph and the daughter, teenage, impatient in the way of bodies that want to run, said, "So they were kind?" Her father considered and aimed for truth rather than a sentence that would end sooner. "They decided to be," he said, and then they practiced. When Keiko's hands began to forget hot from cold and names from faces, her son moved the photograph to the bedside table. On days when the air felt like soup again and the cicadas rehearsed their one song, she would tap the edge of the frame and say to no one, "Horizon," to test if the word would still come when asked. It always did. On the anniversary of the typhoon that had tried to make an island into a lesson, a package arrived from a place Keiko now could find on a globe with one confident finger. Inside, a paper crane, yellowed, edges soft with 1,000 miles of drawer, and a note. "Dear Miss Sato, I am Ruthie's granddaughter. Ruthie kept this on her dresser with a seashell and 3 pennies. She said to send it if I ever found you because objects like to go where they remember being wanted. I am 11. I hope you are okay." Hannah in Kansas. Keiko held the crane to her chest and felt the tiny press of its folded wing through the cotton of her house kimono. She imagined a sky so big it could hold a war and a forgiveness and not split. When she died, a good, long, ordinary death, the photograph and the letters went to the museum with the instruction she'd given her son years earlier. "Let them work." The curator put them under glass with light that made the ink look warmed by noon. People leaned in. They saw, reflected faintly, their own faces hovering over a pier where a man had raised his hand and a woman in a blanket had turned her head to catch a last word. The plaque under the photograph did not use adjectives. It said, "Pier at Chimu Bay, Okinawa. August 1945. Japanese civilian detainee departing for repatriation. U.S. Army Medical Sergeant at right. Donor, Sato family, Kawasaki. M. Miller and family, Lincoln, N.E. We are alive, because an enemy refused to be one." From a letter included with the donation. Visitors reached for the tissue box the museum had begun to keep under the bench without making an exhibit of it. Sometimes a Marine veteran in a ball cap would stand before the glass and touch the brim of his hat. Sometimes a woman who had been a girl during the firebombings would place 2 fingers on the edge of the frame and close her eyes. Sometimes a teenager would take a picture, and later, scrolling, stop at it, and feel the odd gravity of a moment that wouldn't reduce itself to a caption. Stories like to be retold. They change their shoes and go out into weather. They take different streets. They arrive anyway. If you stand long enough in that room, the harmonica will seem to breathe. The paper crane will look like it might lift. The word horizon will underline itself in your mouth. You will hear a line spoken in a storm. The ditch doesn't care what uniform you wear. You will feel like a hand on your back guiding you toward the next necessary thing. Another sentence building itself in your chest. We can decide to be kind, and then we can practice.